Hello, I'm your host, Emma Jones, the first host. I'm an English major with a vested interest in how the writings and descriptions of people and places affect their overall image.
I'm your other host, Raquel Brady. I'll be looking at the more social aspects of the history we'll be presenting today.
And my name is Caden Ide. I am an independent historian of entrepreneurship, and this is the Atlantic is Bigger Than We Thought podcast.
In this podcast, we take figures from American history and see if they measure up to the American dream.
Today we're looking at Christopher Columbus, the spiritual predecessor of every CEO who has tried launching themselves into space over the last 10 years.
So, most of our listeners, I'm pretty sure, know who Christopher Columbus is, but it wouldn't hurt to give a little bit of historical information. The man was allegedly born in Genoa, Italy, according to De Oviedo, one of the writers of the Four Voyages.
Yes, and while he was supposedly born in Genoa, he learned how to sail and navigate in Lisbon, Portugal. From there, he went on a series of journeys to different European countries in order to get funding for a voyage. What's interesting is that according to the History of the Atlantic World podcast, in their episode titled 1492, Columbus had no pre-desired destination for a voyage and presented several options to the patrons. His goals were mainly to be rich and to get his name known in history.
What some might say is cool about Christopher Columbus, and then what some might say is terrible, is how much he's influenced America. Columbus died out and then came back and actually became the embodiment of some of the aspects of America that we recognize even today.
He was even considered to be an American by early Americans. According to the Myths That Made America textbook, he had an American temperament, according to early settlers. I don't know how I would have defined that before reading the book, but they described it as the Americans emphasizing with Columbus's, and I'm quoting here, willpower and stamina in the face of sheer insurmountable obstacles. And this was before America was really America yet. It was during the Revolutionary times, and they were already saying, yeah, this guy's like us. He's an American too, which sort of shows how much this story resonated with the early Americans.
That's interesting because it ties into the American dream that is so connected with our nation's history. While researching this topic, I discovered Adam Barone, a writer for Investopedia. He stated in his article, American Dream, quote, that it is the belief that anyone, regardless of where they were born or what class they were born into, can attain their own version of success in a society in which upward mobility is possible for everyone. The American dream is believed to be achieved through sacrifice, risk-taking, and hard work rather than by chance, end quote. I find that as reminiscent of young upstarts today as it would have been for Columbus if he'd known it.
I would say Columbus fits every single one of those categories perfectly. He took risks, he was willing to go to all the powerful European nations at that time, places like England, Portugal, and Spain, not seeming to care that they all had beef with each other, as the kids would say.
Columbus was described in the Four Voyages with this quote, he persisted in his suit for almost 7 years, repeatedly holding out great prospects of wealth and riches for the crown of Castile, but as his cloak was poor and ragged, he was considered a dreamer and everything he said was taken to be fantastic, end quote. Being an unknown foreigner, he found no one to take him seriously, but he still refused to give up, which really shows that Columbus was not the sort of guy to give up ever, really.
Yes, that's quite interesting, and it also brings up other historical entrepreneurs in the United States history. Many embody that same gritty spirit that Columbus showed. They also experienced similar circumstances, such as being an immigrant. A prime example is Andrew Carnegie, who sailed to the United States from Scotland.
The destitute family flees to America for a new start. And in 1848, at the age of 13, Andrew Carnegie arrives in Pittsburgh.
In today's media, we have Elon Musk, who is a South African immigrant and is now pushing the new space race forward. Both figures have parallels with Columbus. On top of that, there was an underlying attitude for discovery during Columbus' time, just as there is today with regard to certain tech sectors as well as the space race. That's even apparent in colleges today with like Florida Gulf Coast University, which offers programs to teach students how to build platforms and to advertise their skills. Just as Columbus lived in a time of land discovery, we live in a time of digital discovery.
I'd like to go to the comment that both you, Caden, and Raquel have made, which is people going to the moon, which reminds me of the whole idea of Westward Expansion and how we said Columbus is the spiritual predecessor of modern-day expansion efforts. During his time, Columbus was basically partaking in the space race, but over water.
Speaking of water races, the Queen of Spain actually did arrange a small one for this voyage. Basically, what she did was she said the first person who saw land, no matter who it was, would get a lifetime pension, which essentially in modern terms means they could retire right then and there and be set for life. What happened was some guy who was not named Christopher Columbus did see land first one morning, but the night before, Columbus had seen some lights in the distance and had been able to successfully argue that meant he saw the land first. And that meant the other guy did not get the pension. It went to Columbus, and I'm sure he's still smarting over that in his grave.
Oh, that poor guy. And also, let's talk for a second not just about the explorer aspect of Columbus, but also Columbus as an entrepreneur, because he's kind of a predecessor in that area as well. A brother of mine, when I was talking to him about Columbus, actually compared him to a startup CEO, saying that Columbus had that drive and he has that single-minded focus and he was going to do whatever it took to get the job done. However, my brother also said that those same startup CEOs are never able to hold on to the company and manage the company long term because those strengths for that initial startup end up becoming a hindrance because those people are unable to work with others, especially those who do not share that single-minded focus or that vision.
We actually do see some of those issues as early as Columbus's first voyage when he had trouble controlling his crew after they began to get tired of being at sea and worried about how much food they have. What happened was the captain of one of his ships, Pinzon's, had to actually mediate between Columbus and the crew so they didn't mutiny. And even then, he said that, listen, we have 7 more days at sea or else we're turning back so we don't starve to death.
And Caden, since you were the person who kind of introduced us to the idea of American entrepreneurship, especially in modern time, is there anything you'd like to bring back into the conversation about how that ties into the American dream and how that would make Columbus so relevant to us today?
Yes, our contemporary idea of entrepreneurs seems to have remained fairly consistent over the centuries, starting with Columbus. I think I've seen this over and over while researching our nation's history. In a book by Joe Carlin, who wrote entitled A Brief History of Entrepreneurship, the Pioneers, Profiteers, and Racketeers Who Shaped Our World, explained that, quote, Columbus's all-consuming desire for wealth and recognition personified a new generation of European explorers/entrepreneurs and the many thousands of settlers and pioneers who would follow in his wake. I think that spirit is exhibited today with entrepreneurs, gurus, and influencers. Columbus, like many of them, was an independent contractor hired by the Spanish monarchs to do a job by which he sought great wealth. You said, Emma, that Columbus's single-mindedness is characteristic with entrepreneurs, and Columbus certainly demonstrated that to the highest level. As was explained in the History of the Atlantic World podcast, Columbus wanted to become rich and to integrate his descendants in the Spanish nobility.
And, jumping back into the 4 voyages for a second, when Columbus is in one of many violent storms and listing the reasons why he wanted to stay alive, it wasn't just for the wealth and the glory of Spanish nobility. He was afraid of dying before his story and accomplishments ever made it back to the King and Queen of Spain, which I think is also kind of an American thing to do. We want to do things and then be remembered for it.
And it's ironic because he failed so bad at governorship that until the Americas discovered him, he was essentially written out of history by the Spanish monarchy.
Yes, I think it's also telling that he insisted on a permanent appointment as governor of the territories he discovered. And if you have lands, a title, or in this day and age a company, you're going to be remembered with them. We remember people like Steve Jobs for Apple. We remember John D. Rockefeller for Standard Oil. And we'll definitely remember Elon Musk for SpaceX. I think that also extends to the digital now, with many in our generation being familiar with names like Logan Paul, Markiplier, and Mr. Beast, who have become incredibly wealthy and popular by pioneering the development of digital platforms in the last decade. Their personas are now intrinsically tied with the companies and platforms they've created, and that's exactly what happened with Columbus. I mean, everybody is familiar with the names of his 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria.
Meanwhile, I literally just learned about Pinzon's, who was so important because not only was he responsible for keeping Columbus and the crew from killing each other, but his family also gave Columbus the money he needed for these ships and hired out the crew and everything Columbus needed to actually take this voyage. It's sort of like how I don't know anything about Amazon except that it's headed by Jeffrey Bezos, who was born in 1964.
And that name tied to the company thing that both you, Raquel, and Caden have talked about also goes back to Columbus in America. I mean, we have cities named after Columbus. The very spirit of America and the symbol of westward expansion was called Columbia, who's named after, you guessed it, Columbus.
And it's not just Columbus as a spirit of westward expansion that America adopted. Back in the 1840s and 50s, when there was the large immigration booms in huge cities like New York, a bunch of Italian immigrants all decided that Columbus could be their spiritual ancestor, and they highly identified with him, and him being an Italian immigrant who came to the Americas, even if he never set foot in the United States or what would become it. To this day, there are about 11 statues of Columbus in New York City, and all of them are in the Italian neighborhoods for the most part.
That's quite interesting, and I don't think he was remembered in exactly the way he was expected to be. Despite the fact that many people despise him today for what he did, Columbus did accomplish his goal of being remembered. As you pointed out, Raquel, he got the statues, but despite never writing about them in his diaries, I don't think it's too much to assume that statues weren't on his mind. His ego was definitely that type.
Yeah, it's like how if you're a rich person who makes a donation, you want your name to be mentioned in the itinerary, or you want your name on a building, something like that.
I'm not sure if that's an American thing and more like a people thing. It sounds like Columbus might have wanted his own merch store if he was alive today.
Yeah, I agree with you, Emma. I think that megalomaniacal desire to be remembered is in every person. I mean, look at what people are doing today online. There are CEOs and other well-known figures as active in the digital world as they are in the real world. What happened in Columbus's time, and what's happened again with social media and digital reality, is that our world has expanded. It's opening new lands to conquer and new opportunities for enterprise. And by land, I mean digital land in the context of today. With regard to wanting your name to last, there are many places, as you mentioned, Raquel, that are named after Columbus as well as other people.
And I believe you're onto something, Caden, because I think there's something to be said about the relationship of land in Columbus's time, physical land, and the idea of the American dream in the United States. You couldn't have the American dream without having some land to claim as your own. In our modern day, as both Raquel and Caden have pointed out, we have the same kind of expansion happening on a space-wide or on a digital scale. People are buying online platforms left and right to expand, in a sense, their own territory since we don't have any more physical land to claim. But going back to Columbus and the American land, the idea of Americans expanding their territories partially thanks to Columbus and his emphasis on the value and beauty of American geography. I mean, listen to any song about America. They talk about mountains and valleys and prairies. There's an overabundance of description of the natural beauty in the four voyages, and there's one point where Columbus even says, quote, "I can find no words," unquote, to describe how amazing America is compared to the natural beauty of other nations. In lieu of finding gold and precious metals in America, Columbus had to exploit and describe the natural resources that America had to offer Spain. If Columbus described America the way that, say, the Vinland Sagas did, which was a text describing the Vikings' discovery of America, the relationship between America and its geography and how that ties into the whole idea of the American dream might have been very different.
Yes, and I like that you mentioned the Vinland Sagas because they didn't spend a lot of time describing the land or its bountifulness. It was just this place had lots of trees or large rocks.
Which makes sense, considering Columbus actually did have to sell this place to the Spanish, whereas the Vikings could afford to describe it as, "This is a cool place we found. It has some neat grapes." Columbus had to describe it like a scene out of the Genesis, from the Bible, because he had to make up for the fact that, one, he didn't find the route to Asia he promised, two, he didn't know how to properly exploit the land because he knew nothing about it. Like, he found tobacco on his first voyage, but he couldn't sell it because he didn't know what it was, even though it became lucratively popular in Europe a few years later. So he needed something to make this trip worth it, and what he had was this awesome new land he's describing in his journals.
Yeah, and an article by S.R. Wilson called The Form of Discovery kind of wraps up that entire idea in a single quote. "The real and ultimate allure of this new world slowly becomes visible uninhabitable, the land, unquote. Columbus was giving shape to a nameless new place that he discovered, and he does it in a way that is incredibly artistic, or like how you said, Raquel, like he's describing a biblical scene. A lot of our ideas about America as a land do have that predecessor in Columbus, and Wilson's whole article rests on how the discovery of America is communicated through the description of America's land and beauty. There can be no discovery without this description.
And it's not just discovery and description. Columbus shared a lot of the same interests, focus, and ideals as Americans do today. So even if you love him, if you hate him, if you whatever him, you can't deny that Columbus is America's spiritual predecessor in several ways. If you like what you heard and would like to hear more, please consider supporting us on our website.
Join us next month when we discuss Thomas Jefferson and why putting a huge clock in the White House embodies the American dream, and also our terror of the inevitability of time running out to pay off the national debt.